Get out of first class before you embarrass yourself. The words rang through the cabin so sharply that every nearby conversation came to an abrupt stop. Heads turned almost in unison as passengers looked toward the entrance of the first-class section, where a white flight attendant stood firmly in the aisle with one hand resting on the seat nearest the doorway. Across from her stood Naomi Brooks, a 44-year-old black woman dressed in a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers, holding nothing more than a small leather carry-on and a boarding pass. She did not look flustered. She did not look angry. She simply looked at the flight attendant with calm eyes that had learned long ago the difference between confidence and noise. The luxurious cabin glowed beneath warm overhead lighting. Crystal glasses waited beside wide leather seats. Business executives organized laptops. Vacationers settled into comfortable silence. Yet within seconds, the atmosphere felt less like the beginning of a flight and more like the opening scene of a courtroom where judgments had already been made before any evidence had been heard. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said loudly enough for several rows to hear, "economy is toward the back of the aircraft." Naomi politely raised her boarding pass. "My assigned seat is 2 Alpha." The attendant barely looked at it. "I already know where you belong." A businessman lowered his newspaper. An elderly woman removed her reading glasses. A young couple exchanged uncertain glances. Even a little boy seated near the window stopped looking at the airplanes outside and quietly asked his mother, "Why will she not let the lady sit down?" His mother hesitated because she did not know the answer. Naomi continued holding the boarding pass without taking a single step backward. "Would you like to verify it?" she asked gently. "There is nothing to verify," the attendant replied. "You are delaying everyone." The confidence in her voice sounded absolute, but it rested entirely on an assumption she had never bothered to test. Another crew member approached carrying a handheld device. Instead of scanning the boarding pass, he glanced briefly at Naomi's clothes before nodding toward the rear of the aircraft. "We need to keep boarding moving." Naomi noticed every pair of eyes now fixed upon her. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked curious. A few seemed ready to accept whatever explanation the uniform provided. She had seen those expressions before in boardrooms, airports, hotels, and meetings where appearances often spoke louder than truth. Yet experience had taught her that people reveal far more about themselves than about the person they judge. Without raising her voice, she extended the boarding pass one final time. "If my ticket is invalid," she said quietly, "I will gladly cooperate. But if you refuse to read it, then this is no longer about my seat." The sentence lingered in the stillness of the cabin. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across a few passengers' faces. A young flight attendant standing near the galley looked down at her electronic passenger manifest, then back toward Naomi with growing confusion. Something did not seem right. The boarding record on her screen told one story. The scene unfolding before her told another. And as the aircraft waited at the gate with its doors still open, no one inside first class realized that the next decision would change far more than the departure time of a single flight. The young flight attendant near the galley hesitated only briefly before taking another careful look at the electronic passenger manifest. Her name was Mia Turner, and she had been with the airline for less than a month, but she had already learned that procedures existed for a reason. She refreshed the screen once, then a second time. The information never changed. Seat 2 Alpha. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed. No seat conflict. No upgrade error. No boarding restriction. Mia slowly lifted her eyes toward the woman still standing calmly in the aisle. Nothing about the record supported what was happening in front of her. Before she could speak, Captain Daniel Pierce emerged from the cockpit after hearing the raised voices. His crisp uniform and composed posture immediately drew the attention of the entire cabin. Several passengers visibly relaxed, believing the misunderstanding would finally be resolved. Nicole Harris turned toward him with complete confidence. "Captain, this passenger refuses to follow crew instructions and is delaying departure." Daniel nodded once before looking at Naomi. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" Naomi held out her boarding pass again. I have been trying to show this since I arrived. Daniel reached toward it, but Nicole spoke before he could take it. I already handled it. She belongs in economy. Daniel paused. Instead of examining the document himself, he looked back at Nicole, trusting the certainty in her voice. Ma'am, he said politely, I need you to cooperate so we can get everyone on their way. Naomi did not argue. Captain, I am prepared to cooperate with any decision based on facts. I am simply asking that someone read the boarding pass before deciding where I belong. The request was so reasonable that several passengers exchanged quiet glances. Emma Larson, a retired schoolteacher seated across the aisle, slowly folded the magazine resting on her lap. She had watched every second of the exchange and could not understand why the one piece of evidence being offered had never been examined. A businessman named Michael Grant quietly closed his laptop and rested it beside his seat. His attention had shifted completely away from tomorrow's meeting. The only thing that mattered now was whether the crew would verify the simplest fact available. Mia finally gathered enough courage to step forward. Captain, she said carefully, the passenger manifest shows seat 2 Alpha assigned to Ms. Brooks. Nicole turned immediately. Mia, I already reviewed it. Mia glanced back at the screen in her hand. The system still confirms her assignment. Nicole's expression hardened. Return to your position. The firmness in her voice silenced the young attendant, but it did not erase the uncertainty growing across the faces of those watching. Even the little boy near the window leaned toward his mother once again. If the computer says she belongs here, he whispered, why will nobody look at her ticket? His mother had no answer. Captain Pierce stood quietly for several moments, caught between the confidence of his senior flight attendant and the calm consistency of the passenger before him. Naomi remained exactly where she was, never raising her voice, never taking a step toward confrontation. She simply waited with the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth never becomes less true simply because people refuse to examine it. Around them, the first-class cabin no longer felt like the beginning of an ordinary flight. It felt like the moment before a single decision would reveal far more about everyone involved than they ever intended to show. Captain Daniel Pierce remained silent, but the silence no longer carried the confidence it had only moments earlier. He looked from Naomi Brooks to the boarding pass still resting patiently in her hand, then toward Nicole Harris, whose certainty had never once been supported by evidence. Around them, the first-class cabin had become remarkably still. Passengers who had boarded expecting a quiet flight now found themselves witnessing something far more revealing than a disagreement over a seat assignment. They were watching the difference between authority and fairness unfold in real time. Naomi gently lowered her hand, careful not to show frustration. Captain, she said in an even voice, I have offered the same boarding pass 3 times. No one has looked at it once. At what point does refusing to verify become part of the problem? The question lingered in the air. Daniel searched for an immediate answer but found none. Nicole stepped forward before he could respond. We cannot stop the boarding process every time someone questions crew instructions. Naomi nodded slightly. I am not questioning your authority. I am asking you to use it responsibly. Emma Larson quietly smiled to herself. The woman standing beside seat 2 Alpha never raised her voice, yet every sentence seemed to expose another weakness in the crew's decisions. Michael Grant slowly reached for his phone, not out of curiosity anymore, but because he believed moments like this deserved an accurate record. He positioned it discreetly, making certain he was not interfering while quietly documenting the exchange. Near the galley, Mia Turner reopened the electronic passenger manifest once more. The information remained unchanged. Naomi Brooks. Seat 2 Alpha. Boarding complete. She looked at the screen, then at Naomi, then back toward Captain Pierce. Every instinct told her the system was correct. Every procedure she had learned during training instructed crew members to verify documentation whenever uncertainty existed. Yet no one with authority seemed willing to perform the simplest step. Captain, Mia said carefully, company policy recommends direct verification when passenger records and verbal concerns do not match. Nicole immediately turned toward her. I already told you this has been handled. Mia hesitated, but this time she did not lower the device. With respect, the system does not show that it has. Several passengers quietly exchanged glances. The businessman seated near the window folded his newspaper. Another traveler removed his headphones. The little boy who had been asking questions throughout the delay looked up at his mother once again. If everyone can solve this by looking at one piece of paper, he whispered, why is nobody doing it? His mother looked toward Naomi before answering softly. Sometimes people decide what they believe before they decide to look. Those words seemed to settle over the cabin like a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Naomi heard them and gave the woman a grateful smile before returning her attention to Captain Pierce. Daniel could feel the atmosphere changing. This was no longer simply a conversation between crew and passenger. Every decision was now being measured by dozens of witnesses who had seen exactly how the situation had unfolded. Nicole crossed her arms, convinced that confidence alone would carry the day. Naomi remained composed, saying nothing further. She had learned long ago that there comes a moment when speaking less reveals more than speaking louder. As the aircraft remained motionless at the gate with the boarding door still open, one uncomfortable reality began spreading quietly through the first-class cabin. The delay was no longer being caused by the woman holding a valid boarding pass. It was being caused by the people who refused to read it. The quiet inside the cabin became almost impossible to ignore. Even the gentle sound of the air conditioning seemed louder now that every conversation had faded away. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside seat 2 Alpha, her boarding pass still resting calmly in her hand, never once forcing it toward anyone, never once demanding special treatment. She simply continued offering the same opportunity that had been ignored from the moment she stepped into first class. Captain Daniel Pierce looked around the cabin and realized dozens of passengers were no longer waiting for the aircraft to depart. They were waiting to see whether fairness would finally appear. Nicole Harris sensed the shift in the room immediately. She folded her arms and spoke with even greater confidence. Captain, if we hesitate every time someone challenges a crew decision, we lose control of the cabin. Daniel did not respond right away. Instead, he glanced once more toward Naomi, who remained remarkably composed despite every assumption made about her. Emma Larson slowly leaned into the aisle. Captain, she said respectfully, may I ask one question? Daniel nodded politely. If verifying a boarding pass takes only a few seconds, why has no one done it? The simplicity of the question settled over the cabin like a weight. Michael Grant quietly added, everyone here has watched her offer the same document several times. Nobody has refused to cooperate except the people refusing to read it. Several passengers nodded in agreement. The atmosphere was changing one careful observation at a time. Near the galley, Mia Turner looked back down at her handheld device. She enlarged the passenger details once again, determined to understand whether she had overlooked something. She had not. Naomi Brooks remained listed as the confirmed passenger for seat 2 Alpha. Then Mia noticed a small administrative timestamp in the corner of the display. It indicated that the reservation file had been accessed only minutes earlier, well after boarding had begun. She frowned. That was unusual. Routine boarding rarely triggered mid-process administrative activity unless another department had requested information. Mia quietly refreshed the record. The timestamp remained. Nicole noticed the concern on Mia's face. What is it now? She asked. Mia hesitated before answering. The passenger record shows recent administrative activity. Nicole dismissed the observation immediately. Systems update all the time. Mia knew that was not entirely accurate, but she remained silent. Naomi observed the exchange without saying a word. She recognized the expression on Mia's face. It was the look of someone beginning to trust evidence more than assumptions. The little boy near the window tugged gently on his mother's sleeve again. Mom, he whispered, I think the nice lady is telling the truth. His mother smiled sadly. Sometimes the truth has to wait for people to be willing to see it. Naomi heard the words and gave the child a warm smile that lasted only a moment before returning her attention to Captain Pierce. Daniel slowly exhaled. The situation no longer resembled a disagreement over seating. Every passing minute made the unanswered questions more difficult to ignore. Nicole remained convinced that confidence alone would carry the day, while Mia quietly watched her screen, sensing that something beyond the aircraft had already begun moving. Naomi slipped her boarding pass carefully back into its holder, not because she had given up hope that someone would read it, but because she understood that there are moments when the truth no longer needs to be offered. It simply waits for everyone else to catch up. And somewhere beyond the cabin, unseen by every passenger and crew member on board, the first quiet step toward that truth had already begun. Captain Daniel Pierce could feel the mood inside the cabin changing with every passing second. At first, passengers had trusted the confidence of the uniform. Now they were beginning to trust the consistency of the woman who had never once changed her story. Naomi Brooks remained standing quietly beside seat 2 Alpha, her carry-on resting neatly at her side. She had not demanded special treatment. She had not raised her voice. She had simply continued asking for one thing that no one seemed willing to provide: verification. Nicole Harris interpreted the growing silence differently. To her, hesitation looked like weakness. She took one confident step forward and addressed the cabin almost as much as she addressed Naomi. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are handling a passenger issue, and we appreciate your patience." Before anyone could return to their own thoughts, Michael Grant spoke from across the aisle. With respect, the passenger issue could be resolved in less than 10 seconds if someone scanned the boarding pass. Several heads nodded. Emma Larson quietly added, "That seems like the simplest solution." Nicole answered immediately, "Crew procedures are not open for discussion." Naomi looked toward Nicole with the same calm expression she had maintained from the beginning. "Procedures exist to protect everyone," she said gently. "They only lose their value when people decide not to follow them." Captain Pierce heard the sentence and found himself unable to dismiss it. He had spent his entire career teaching younger crew members that every decision should begin with facts, yet somehow the simplest fact available had remained untouched. Near the galley, Mia Turner refreshed her handheld device once more. The reservation information remained unchanged, but another detail caught her attention. The administrative timestamp had updated again. Someone outside the aircraft had accessed the passenger record for a second time. That almost never happened during ordinary boarding. Mia quietly studied the display, trying to understand what department would review a single passenger record while the aircraft was still at the gate. She did not yet know the answer, but she knew enough to recognize that something unusual had begun. The little boy sitting near the window watched Naomi carefully. "Mom," he whispered, "she does not look scared." His mother smiled softly. Sometimes people stay calm because they know the truth is on their side. Naomi overheard the comment and gave the child a warm, reassuring smile before returning her attention to the crew. Brian Collins looked impatiently toward Captain Pierce. "Captain, we cannot stay here forever." Daniel slowly nodded but did not speak immediately. For the first time since leaving the cockpit, he looked directly at the boarding pass in Naomi's hand instead of at Nicole. He appeared ready to say something, but Nicole spoke before he could. "Captain, we have already wasted enough time." The confidence in her voice remained strong, yet it no longer carried the same influence it had only minutes earlier. Around the first-class cabin, passengers were quietly reaching the same conclusion. The delay no longer belonged to the woman holding a boarding pass. It belonged to the people refusing to verify it. Naomi slipped the boarding pass back into its holder with quiet patience, as though she understood that there are moments when proving the truth is no longer necessary because the refusal to examine it becomes evidence all by itself. Somewhere beyond the aircraft, unseen by everyone in the cabin, another set of eyes had already begun reviewing the same passenger record, and the choices made inside first class were about to matter far more than anyone on board could possibly imagine. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes for only a brief moment, and the voices surrounding her slowly faded beneath memories she had carried for more than 20 years. The polished walls of the aircraft seemed to disappear as another airport came into focus, another departure gate, another younger version of herself standing quietly with a single suitcase and a folder filled with business plans that almost no one believed would amount to anything. She remembered arriving early for a small aviation investment conference after saving every dollar she could. Her clothes had been simple. Her dream had been enormous. She had watched people greet one another with confidence while she stood alone, determined to earn a place in an industry where very few people expected someone like her to succeed. She still remembered an airline employee looking at her ticket, then at her face, before politely asking whether she was certain she belonged in the premium boarding line. The words had sounded courteous, but the assumption behind them stayed with her long after the flight had landed. That day she promised herself something she had never shared with anyone. She would spend the rest of her career building opportunities instead of arguing with prejudice. She would create businesses where facts mattered more than appearances and where respect would never depend upon clothing, status, or first impressions. The memory slowly dissolved as the first-class cabin returned around her. The leather seats, polished wood accents, quiet passengers, and waiting crew all looked familiar in a different way. The setting had changed. The lesson had not. Naomi looked toward the aircraft window where sunlight reflected across the wing. Every challenge she had overcome had prepared her for moments exactly like this one. She did not need strangers to recognize her value because she had spent decades proving it to herself. Emma Larson noticed the peaceful expression on Naomi's face and quietly wondered how someone under such public scrutiny could remain so composed. Michael Grant noticed it as well. He had expected frustration by now, perhaps even anger, yet Naomi displayed neither. Her confidence seemed rooted somewhere deeper than the opinions surrounding her. Near the galley, Mia Turner continued studying the electronic manifest. The passenger information remained unchanged, but another small administrative notification briefly appeared before disappearing again. She frowned. Something within the airline's internal system had requested access to the reservation for a second time. That almost never happened during routine boarding. She refreshed the display once more, hoping to understand what she was seeing, but the notification had already vanished. Captain Daniel Pierce shifted his weight uneasily. He could sense that the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. The passengers were no longer simply waiting for departure. They were waiting to see whether fairness would finally overcome assumption. Nicole Harris, however, interpreted the silence differently. She believed hesitation meant that everyone would eventually accept her judgment without further questions. Naomi gently reached into the pocket of her sweater and rested her hand on her phone without removing it. Her expression remained calm, almost reflective. She had learned long ago that there comes a moment when explaining yourself no longer changes minds. Instead, the truth finds another path. She looked once toward Captain Pierce before quietly making a decision of her own. No one around her realized it yet, but the next action she took would ensure that this story would soon extend far beyond the walls of the aircraft, reaching people who cared far more about evidence than assumptions. Naomi Brooks slowly removed her phone from the pocket of her sweater, her movements so calm that almost no one in the cabin noticed. There was no dramatic gesture, no expression of frustration, and no attempt to prove herself to the people standing in front of her. She unlocked the screen, selected a single contact, and placed the call. The connection was answered almost immediately. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," a composed voice said. Naomi spoke quietly enough that only the people closest to her could hear. "Sophia, initiate Protocol Atlas. Phase 1. There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. "Confirmed," Sophia replied. "Phase 1 is now active. Do you require executive verification at this time?" Naomi glanced briefly toward Captain Daniel Pierce before answering. "Not yet. Preserve everything and begin the review." "Understood. Executive monitoring has started." The call ended. Naomi slipped the phone back into her pocket as naturally as if she had confirmed a dinner reservation. Nicole Harris watched the brief conversation with an amused smile. "Calling someone is not going to change your seat assignment," she said confidently. Brian Collins quietly laughed. Everyone suddenly has an important contact when things do not go their way. Naomi did not respond. She had already made the only call that mattered. Michael Grant noticed something unusual about the exchange. Naomi had not asked for help. She had not sounded upset. She had simply issued a short instruction, then ended the conversation without another word. Emma Larson noticed the same thing. It was the confidence of someone who expected a process to begin, not someone hoping for a favor. Near the galley, Mia Turner refreshed the electronic passenger manifest once again. A small synchronization icon appeared in the upper corner of her device before disappearing almost instantly. She frowned. The reservation file was communicating with another department inside the airline's network. That almost never happened during normal boarding. She refreshed the display again. The icon returned for a brief moment, then vanished. "Captain," Mia said carefully, "the passenger record is being accessed remotely." Daniel turned toward her. "By whom?" Mia looked at the screen. "It does not identify the department. It only shows that the file is under active review." Nicole immediately dismissed the observation. "Probably a routine system update." Mia wanted to agree, but she could not. She had completed enough training to recognize that routine updates did not begin in the middle of a boarding dispute involving a single passenger. Captain Pierce folded his arms, trying to restore order inside the cabin. "Everyone, please remain patient while we resolve this matter." Naomi looked at him with quiet sincerity. "Captain, the matter is already being resolved. It is simply happening somewhere you cannot see yet." Daniel frowned, unsure what she meant. Brian shook his head. "That sounds like another empty threat." Naomi smiled politely. "It is not a threat. It is a review." Those words settled over the cabin with unexpected weight. Even Nicole's expression shifted ever so slightly before she regained her confidence. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage carts crossed the ramp while ground crews completed the last preparations for departure. Everything beyond the cabin appeared perfectly ordinary. Inside the aircraft, however, something had begun to change. The passengers could feel it without understanding why. Naomi remained beside seat 2 Alpha, calm and patient as ever, while somewhere beyond the gate, unseen by everyone aboard, the first pieces of a much larger picture were already falling into place. Nearly 800 miles away, inside the airline's operations control center, the afternoon had begun like any other. Large digital displays tracked departures across the country while analysts quietly monitored weather, maintenance schedules, and aircraft routing. Then a discreet notification appeared on a secure executive dashboard. Protocol Atlas. Phase 1. Authentication confirmed. Sophia Bennett, Director of Executive Operations, looked at the alert for less than a second before setting her coffee aside. "Open Executive Review Channel 7, she said calmly. "Preserve all records connected to Flight 278. Begin passive monitoring." Around the room, there were no flashing lights and no dramatic alarms. Instead, several departments quietly synchronized behind the scenes. Compliance secured passenger records. Information technology archived system activity. Legal services automatically placed the flight under evidence preservation. Operations began reviewing every digital event associated with the boarding process. Everything happened silently, without notifying anyone on the aircraft. Back inside the first-class cabin, Nicole Harris remained convinced that she still controlled the situation. "Captain," she said confidently, "we need to finish boarding. This delay has gone on long enough." Captain Daniel Pierce looked toward Naomi Brooks again. He expected frustration. Instead, she remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, patient, and completely composed. Brian Collins glanced at his watch. "She is trying to intimidate everyone with one phone call," he muttered. Naomi heard him but simply smiled. "No," she replied quietly. "I am allowing the process to do its job." Michael Grant noticed another small detail. Mia Turner's handheld device refreshed itself without her touching the screen. A synchronization symbol appeared briefly, disappeared, then returned once again. Mia frowned. She had worked with the airline's boarding system long enough to know this behavior was unusual. She quietly opened the activity log. Multiple administrative reviews had been initiated, yet none of them identified the department requesting access. Emma Larson leaned slightly toward Mia. "Is something happening?" she asked softly. Mia hesitated before answering. "Someone outside this aircraft is reviewing the reservation records in real time." Emma slowly looked toward Naomi. The woman standing beside seat 2 Alpha had not changed her posture once, yet somehow the entire situation seemed to be changing around her. Captain Pierce folded his arms, trying to reassure both crew and passengers. "Everyone, please remain patient. We are resolving the matter." Naomi met his eyes with quiet sincerity. "Captain, I believe someone already is." Danielle searched her expression for uncertainty but found none. Outside the aircraft windows, the final ground service vehicles rolled away from the gate while sunlight reflected across the polished fuselage. Everything appeared ready for departure. Inside the airline's secure network, however, another review had just begun. Every login connected to the boarding process, every passenger record accessed, every crew action, and every system update was quietly assembling into a complete timeline that no opinion could alter. Sophia Bennett received the first audit summary and studied it carefully. Without changing her calm expression, she forwarded the report to executive compliance and instructed her team to continue monitoring without contacting the aircraft. "Not yet," she said. "Let the facts finish arriving." Back inside the cabin, Nicole continued believing that silence meant agreement. Naomi understood something very different. She knew that truth often traveled more quietly than assumptions, but once it reached its destination, it never needed anyone's permission to be heard. The quiet inside the first-class cabin no longer felt ordinary. It felt expectant, as though everyone sensed that something invisible had begun moving beyond the aircraft walls. Captain Daniel Pierce looked toward the boarding door, then back at Naomi Brooks. The certainty that had guided him only minutes earlier had begun giving way to hesitation. Nicole Harris, however, remained unwavering. She folded her arms and spoke with practiced confidence. "Captain, we cannot continue entertaining this discussion. Boarding has been delayed long enough." Brian Collins nodded in agreement. "If we do not move forward now, we will miss our departure window." Naomi listened without interrupting. When Brian finished speaking, she simply replied, "A delay caused by verifying the truth is very different from a delay caused by refusing to verify it." The sentence settled over the cabin with unexpected weight. Emma Larson quietly looked around at the other passengers. Several people who had remained silent from the beginning were now watching the crew instead of Naomi. Michael Grant continued recording discreetly, realizing that the story unfolding before him was no longer about a seating assignment. It had become a lesson in how quickly assumptions could replace facts. Near the galley, Mia Turner refreshed her handheld device once again. This time, instead of the brief synchronization symbol she had seen before, a new notification appeared at the top of the screen. Administrative review active. Certain system functions had become temporarily unavailable, and the reservation record could no longer be edited. Mia stared at the message. She had never seen that happen during routine boarding. She quietly approached Captain Pierce and lowered her voice. "Captain, the passenger record has been placed under administrative review. The file is locked." Daniel looked at her with surprise. "Locked by whom?" Mia shook her head. "The system does not identify the department." Before Daniel could ask another question, Nicole stepped between them. "Captain, internal system updates are not unusual. We should not allow technical messages to distract us from completing boarding." Mia hesitated. She respected Nicole's experience, yet something about the explanation felt incomplete. Naomi noticed Mia's uncertainty but remained silent. She understood that truth often revealed itself one careful observation at a time. The little boy seated near the window looked up at his mother once again. "Mom, if people keep checking her file, does that mean someone else wants to know what really happened? His mother smiled gently. That is usually how the truth begins. Captain Pierce slowly exhaled. He could feel the atmosphere shifting around him. The passengers no longer appeared impatient with Naomi. Instead, many seemed to be waiting for the crew to perform the one action that should have happened from the very beginning. Nicole sensed the growing change in mood and became even more determined. Captain, she said firmly, we need a final decision. Daniel looked toward Naomi, who remained standing quietly beside seat 2 Alpha, completely composed despite the growing tension surrounding her. She met his eyes and spoke with calm sincerity. Captain, every decision made after this moment will become part of the story. I hope the next one begins with evidence. Daniel did not answer immediately. Outside the aircraft, the final preparations for departure continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside the cabin, however, every passing second carried the unmistakable feeling that someone, somewhere beyond the gate, was putting together a complete picture of everything that had taken place, and when that picture finally arrived, no opinion would be able to change what the facts had already recorded. Captain Daniel Pierce looked from Naomi Brooks to Nicole Harris, then toward the passengers whose attention had become completely fixed on the aisle. Whatever authority had once carried the conversation forward was now being replaced by quiet uncertainty. Nicole refused to acknowledge the change. She straightened her uniform and spoke with renewed confidence. Captain, we have reached the end of this discussion. If she refuses to relocate, we need to proceed without further delay. Brian Collins nodded in agreement. Every additional minute affects the entire flight. Naomi listened without interruption. When the cabin became quiet again, she spoke in the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. There is one thing that has remained unchanged since I boarded this aircraft. My reservation. My boarding pass. The facts. Nicole folded her arms. Facts do not change the reality that you are delaying everyone else. Emma Larson quietly shook her head. No, she said. The delay began the moment evidence stopped mattering. A few passengers murmured in agreement. Michael Grant lowered his phone just enough to speak. All anyone has asked for is verification. Captain Pierce could feel the balance inside the cabin shifting. He had spent years making quick decisions under pressure, yet this situation no longer felt simple. Naomi reached into the inside pocket of her sweater and removed a slim black card. She did not wave it in the air or present it dramatically. She simply held it comfortably in one hand. Brian glanced at it with a skeptical smile. Another membership card? Naomi looked directly at him. No. Nicole answered before Naomi could continue. Whatever it is, it will not change today's decision. Naomi's expression remained peaceful. That depends on whether today's decision is based on assumptions or facts. The cabin fell silent once again. Even the little boy near the window stopped whispering. Captain Pierce found himself unable to look away. There was something unmistakably genuine about the confidence standing before him. It was not the confidence of someone trying to impress strangers. It was the quiet certainty of someone who already knew how the story would end. Naomi slowly lowered the card but kept it in her hand. You have questioned whether I belong in this seat, she said softly. You questioned my reservation before reading it. You questioned my presence before verifying it. She paused briefly, allowing the silence to settle across the cabin. There is something else you should know before anyone makes another decision. Nicole forced a smile that no longer appeared as certain as before. Please, go ahead. Naomi met her eyes without the slightest trace of anger. The company that controls the operating carrier for this aircraft answers to the organization I lead. Brian frowned. Captain Pierce remained perfectly still. Naomi continued with the same measured voice. In simple terms, I own this airplane. No one laughed. No one challenged the statement. The words landed with unexpected calm, making the silence that followed feel even louder. Emma slowly widened her eyes. Michael instinctively lowered his phone for the first time since he began recording. Mia Turner looked from Naomi to the administrative review notice still glowing on her handheld device, and for the first time all afternoon, the strange system activity finally seemed to make sense. Nicole stared at Naomi for several long seconds before answering with a strained smile. "That is a very extraordinary claim." Naomi nodded politely. "Then I recommend verifying that one as carefully as you should have verified my boarding pass." At that exact moment, a sharp electronic tone echoed from the cockpit, announcing the arrival of a secure executive communication that none of the crew had been expecting. The electronic tone echoed through the quiet cabin with surprising clarity. Captain Daniel Pierce turned immediately toward the cockpit, recognizing that the sound did not belong to an ordinary operational message. Without saying a word, he excused himself and stepped through the cockpit door. The passengers watched it close behind him, leaving the first-class cabin suspended in complete silence. Nicole Harris folded her arms once again, determined not to let the unexpected interruption affect her confidence. "This changes nothing," she said firmly, looking directly at Naomi Brooks. "Claims are still only claims." Naomi answered with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning. "That is exactly why they should always be verified." Michael Grant glanced toward the closed cockpit door. Something about the timing felt impossible to ignore. Emma Larson quietly noticed that even Brian Collins had stopped speaking. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty had reached every corner of the cabin. Inside the cockpit, Captain Pierce approached the secure operations display mounted beside the primary flight instruments. A bright executive notification filled the screen. Executive Operations. Priority Communication. Immediate captain response required. Daniel accepted the request and placed the secure headset over his ears. Captain Pierce speaking. A calm, professional voice answered immediately. "Captain, this is Sophia Bennett from Executive Operations. Please confirm that passenger Naomi Brooks remains aboard Flight 278. Daniel looked through the open cockpit doorway toward the first-class cabin where Naomi still stood beside seat 2 Alpha. "Confirmed," he replied. Sophia continued without hesitation. "Maintain her current location. Do not alter her reservation. Do not request that she relocate. Executive verification is in progress, and the flight has been placed under administrative review." Daniel frowned. "May I ask what prompted this review?" There was a brief pause before Sophia answered. "Captain, you will receive complete authorization shortly. Until then, preserve the current boarding status and await further instruction." The secure connection ended. Daniel slowly removed the headset, but before he could leave the cockpit, another encrypted message appeared on the display. Identity verification completed. Executive authorization confirmed. Additional briefing incoming. Daniel stared at the screen for several long seconds. He had never seen this level of executive communication connected to a passenger boarding dispute. Outside the cockpit, Mia Turner looked down at her handheld device. The administrative review notice changed again. Reservation protected. Executive access active. She quietly inhaled. The reservation could no longer be modified by anyone at the gate. Nicole noticed Mia studying the screen. "What is happening now?" she asked. Mia answered honestly. "The reservation has been placed under executive protection." Nicole forced a brief smile that no longer appeared convincing. "There must be some mistake." Naomi remained silent. She neither celebrated nor reacted. She simply waited with the calm confidence of someone who had trusted the process from the very beginning. The little boy sitting near the window whispered softly to his mother, "I think the airplane is finding out who she really is." His mother looked toward Naomi and smiled gently. "No," she replied. "The airplane is finally taking the time to find out the truth." At that exact moment, the cockpit door opened once again. Captain Daniel Pierce stepped back into the cabin with an expression none of the passengers had seen before. The certainty that had guided his earlier decisions had disappeared completely, replaced by the unmistakable realization that the next words spoken aboard Flight 278 would change everything. Captain Daniel Pierce walked slowly into the first-class cabin, and before he spoke a single word, everyone sensed that something had changed. His expression no longer reflected certainty. It reflected careful reflection. Nicole Harris searched his face for reassurance, but he did not look toward her first. Instead, he turned to Naomi Brooks. "Ms. Brooks," he said respectfully, "thank you for your patience." The simple sentence immediately transformed the atmosphere inside the cabin. Nicole looked at him in disbelief. "Captain?" Daniel raised one hand gently, asking for a moment of quiet. At that instant, the secure tablet beside the cockpit emitted another notification. A live executive connection request appeared on the display. Daniel accepted it, and within seconds the face of Richard Lawson, chairman of Apex Aviation Holdings, appeared on the screen. His calm expression filled the monitor while the secure audio carried throughout the first-class cabin. "Good afternoon, Captain Pierce," he began. "I understand there has been an unresolved matter involving Ms. Naomi Brooks." Daniel answered respectfully. "Yes, sir." Richard nodded once before continuing. "Allow me to remove any remaining uncertainty. Ms. Naomi Brooks serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Aviation Holdings. Our company controls the organization operating this aircraft, and she is traveling today under a fully confirmed reservation as part of an unannounced executive service review. Her reservation has been valid from the moment boarding began." Silence settled over every seat in the cabin. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the soft background sounds of the aircraft seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the words that had just been spoken. Richard continued calmly. "Executive Operations has preserved the complete boarding timeline, including passenger records, crew actions, and system activity. Every decision has been documented. Captain, your responsibility now is to ensure that Ms. Brooks receives the same professionalism every passenger deserves." Daniel answered immediately. "Understood, sir." The secure connection ended. For several long moments, the first-class cabin remained completely still. Nicole Harris lowered her eyes, no longer able to maintain the confidence she had displayed throughout the afternoon. Brian Collins looked toward the floor without saying a word. Mia Turner quietly smiled, not because anyone had been proven wrong, but because the truth had finally been given the opportunity to speak for itself. Emma Larson gently placed a hand over her heart. "I knew something did not feel right," she whispered. Michael Grant slowly lowered his phone. The most remarkable part of the story, he realized, had never been the executive confirmation. It had been watching someone remain calm while everyone around her rushed to conclusions. Naomi looked toward Nicole with the same kindness she had shown from the beginning. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to embarrass anyone, only quiet dignity. Nicole finally managed to speak. "Ms. Brooks, Naomi gently interrupted with a small shake of her head. "Please do not apologize because you discovered my position," she said softly. "Ask yourself whether anything would have been different if you had never learned who I was." Those words carried more weight than any executive title could. Captain Pierce slowly reached toward the boarding pass Naomi had offered since the beginning of the encounter. This time he accepted it, looked at it carefully, and then handed it back with genuine respect. "The reservation never changed," he admitted quietly. Naomi smiled warmly. "No, Captain. Only the willingness to verify it did." Around the cabin, passengers quietly returned to their seats with a new understanding. They had arrived expecting an ordinary flight. Instead, they had witnessed how quickly assumptions can replace fairness, and how quietly the truth can restore it once people finally choose to look. The last passenger quietly settled back into a seat as Captain Daniel Pierce completed the final boarding procedures. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge slowly pulled away, and moments later the aircraft began moving gently from the gate. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin no longer resembled the tension that had filled it only minutes before. Instead, a thoughtful silence surrounded everyone on board. Naomi Brooks finally took her seat in 2 Alpha without ceremony, placing her small leather carry-on beneath the seat in front of her with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she stepped aboard. Captain Pierce approached her one final time before returning to the cockpit. "Ms. Brooks," he said sincerely, "I cannot change what happened today, but I can learn from it. Thank you for reminding all of us why verification must always come before judgment." Naomi looked up with a gentle smile. "Captain, every leader faces difficult moments. The important part is deciding what lesson follows them." Daniel nodded respectfully before returning to the cockpit. Nicole Harris remained near the front galley for several moments, reflecting quietly. She understood that the most painful part of the afternoon had not been discovering Naomi's position within the company. It had been realizing how easily certainty had replaced curiosity. Mia Turner approached Naomi with a warm expression. "Thank you for staying calm," she said softly. Naomi smiled. "Calm gives the truth time to arrive." Mia nodded, knowing she would remember those words throughout her career. Emma Larson leaned across the aisle with a smile of admiration. "I spent decades teaching children that character matters more than appearances," she said. "Today I watched someone prove that lesson better than any textbook ever could." Michael Grant quietly placed his phone into his briefcase. He had captured nearly every moment of the encounter, yet he realized the most important part would never be found in the recording itself. It would remain in the example of someone who chose dignity over anger and patience over pride. The little boy sitting beside the window looked toward Naomi one last time before the aircraft turned toward the runway. "Mom," he whispered, "I hope I remember this when I grow up." His mother gently squeezed his hand. "If you remember only one thing," she answered, "remember to learn the truth before deciding who someone is." Naomi looked out the window as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. The city slowly disappeared beneath the wings, and the afternoon sunlight stretched across the clouds ahead. She reached into her bag, removed a small leather notebook, and wrote a single sentence across the top of a blank page. "Character should never need a title before it earns respect." She closed the notebook and rested it beside her seat, knowing that the lesson from this flight would travel much farther than the aircraft itself. Somewhere inside the airline's headquarters, reports would be reviewed, procedures would be strengthened, and conversations would begin about ensuring that fairness remained stronger than assumption. Yet Naomi understood that lasting change never begins with policies alone. It begins with individual choices made in ordinary moments. Every passenger aboard Flight 278 would leave carrying a different memory of the day, but they would all remember one undeniable truth. Real leadership is not measured by how loudly a person demands respect. It is measured by the quiet confidence to remain faithful to the truth even when no one else is willing to see it. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, the confrontation was already becoming part of the past, but the lesson it left behind would continue traveling long after the journey itself had ended.